I think we want to bring up all the speakers now and move to questions. If anybody has any questions, come on up, speakers, and they'd be happy to answer questions anybody has. Anyone?
So when would hydrogen production actually be green as opposed to blue, or whatever terminology we want to use?
Who wants to take that?
Lou, is that a good one for you or not?
I can start. So electrolysis is green, right? I mean, but you have to generate the electricity. So you got to have mechanisms to get a lot of electricity and have the electricity not create more pollution than you're trying to fix in the first place. So that becomes nuclear, really building out solar a lot more, and wind power. And quite frankly, you have to have battery technologies and other things at the back, so to be able to store. So I think, you know, we've got some decisions to make. We're working on small modular reactors as a new technology in this country, but we have to figure out what we're gonna do with the waste. We have to work the policy sides. And we have to see if we can actually do the regulation around one to actually build one and get in service. That's been a challenge for the country for the last decades. So I think those are the, you know, none of these things come for free. Even the wonderful batteries that we love, the mining to cause them and the places they come from are pretty tough on the environment. So this is what I think is really needed is the system engineering trade and the looks across these different technologies to really find out what works the best and then how we can meld and mesh those together. I think that this could be more of an and than a which as we go through this process as a country.
Angela, you have anything to
Yeah,
add?
I want to add to that just real quick. So right now, wind and solar is built to how much you could store, right? Let's say you had let's say you had 100 megawatts of wind and 100 megawatts of solar, 200 megawatts. You can't put that on the grid because you're not demanding that all the time. And it's fluctuating, coming at different times, right? There's a duck curve there. And so you're not going to be able to store all that energy, right? And so what hydrogen can do when you combine electrolysis, right, which is basically starting with water and adding electricity coming from these green areas, and you turn it into hydrogen, now you can store it. Basically becomes a way to store it. And the difference between that and batteries, and why it's so important, is batteries, when you're storing about 7 megawatts, that's your limit. 7 megawatts is the magic number. You can store 7 megawatts with batteries and be competitive to electrolysis with hydrogen. Once you go past that is when you want hydrogen, because now it's much, much, much cheaper. And so what you can do, what I'm saying is you can actually build larger wind and larger solar in different parts of the country that have those things, and you could store a lot more of it. And now you can distribute that with industrial gas, hydrogen, to all the different industries that need that, whether it is electrolysis or I guess using it for electricity with a fuel cell, or using it to basically use other things. You can actually burn hydrogen like a turbine and still have a green hydrogen from that, right? So I just want to touch on that a little bit. Good point.
Lou, do you want to talk about what the net carbon footprint would be when you add carbon sequestration to blue hydrogen? Because it's really not very big.
Yeah, that's the other, and it's a little, in fact, I got my guys here who actually know all the details of this, and they can talk to it much better than I can. But we've proven that we can pull the majority of the carbon off these waste flows. Now, it does take energy to do it, so you drop efficiency. And the reason, you know, if you look at carbon sequestration today, we're focusing mostly on clean streams like ethanol production and places like that where it's pretty economical. As you get into natural gas and you get into coal, you have to use a lot more of the energy to do that, but you can clean it. But right now you have to make it economical, right? So either the government has to subsidize that power loss, you know, or the ratepayers of the utility have to be willing to pay more pennies. But we have technologies that can do this that exist today that I think are great what I call transition technologies, right? They're not things we want to do forever, but they can buy us over for the next few decades as we move toward being able to build, you know, totally green systems and build that capacity.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, please.
Another thing to think about too is this will be a part of this hub effort is using renewable natural gas, and that's coming from landfills, that's coming from farms, and so really what you're doing at that point is it's actually carbon negative when you take that out, and it's also then diverting waste methane. It's actually a worse greenhouse gas than CO2. So I think all that is going to be a part of this effort. Yeah.
And I think when you look at what's happened to our carbon footprint with natural gas in general, we've actually reduced our carbon levels below what the Kyoto protocols would have called, mostly because of the rise in natural gas. So natural gas is very clean burning. It's still a fossil fuel, still some carbon, but a very clean burning fossil fuel. And so don't ignore that in blue hydrogen either. I guess I just want to make that point.
You know, if I'd add one last piece as well, if we can look at what's happening in the world right now, if you have a shortage of energy, if people are cold and hungry, climate change is not the top thing on their mind. So what we've seen even before, as Europe went to many more renewables, but they weren't getting the production they expected, and they turned off their gas, they saw 2-4x increases in gas prices, natural gas prices, and heating prices before the Ukraine event started, and then we've seen what's happened since then. So I think we have to be careful to do this transition in a way that we're not taking away people's safety and security in the process before the new things can
Right,
come
yeah,
on. That's where
price,
this
right.
government funding can really speed things up.
Yep.
Great point.
I asked because I want to follow here. If there's gas being pumped in and you still have methane emissions coming up from the gas and you still have CO2 produced, to what extent is this really a clean technology until you have electrolysis at some kind of scale level?
It's still cleaner than the alternative. I mean, you have to look at things based on, if you're gonna have the buses that he doesn't have that are hydrogen are diesel buses. So everything is compared to something else. So when you compare it to an internal combustion engine and what comes out of the tailpipe of that, it's pretty green.
I know, Lou, you've got the best answer for this, but let me just say I'm a generalist. I could generalize this for you, make you understand it really quickly. So what he's talking about with sequestration, you can have something starting as methane, right? Then you can create hydrogen from that through steam methane reformation, and you will have a byproduct, as you're referring to. What he's talking about is actually cleaning that up so you don't have the byproduct. What he's worried about is the amount of energy it takes to clean it up. But that will become cheaper as we continue to invest in technology. And so it will actually be clean when you sequester that process, right? One other thing I want to add is once it goes through a fuel cell works by sucking in oxygen too through these massive filters. A fuel cell vehicle actually cleans the air as it operates. I want to point that out as well. Most people don't understand that. And when South Korea, which is huge into hydrogen, the reason they're huge in hydrogen is because they didn't want a zero emissions technology. They wanted to reduce emissions. So they said, forget about batteries. Let's get hydrogen because it's actually going to help clean our air. So it's reducing emissions also when it's in a fuel cell.
Great point.
And one last point I would just say is methane's a tough, it's a tough gas as far as global warming, but on the good side, it stays in the atmosphere about 7 years. Carbon dioxide stays in for about 100 years. So things we're doing with carbon dioxide today, our grandchildren are going to be dealing with many years from now.
Great point.
One of the big criticisms of carbon capture is that it's just enormously expensive. So what incentive do these oil and gas companies have to adopt this technology?
I'll start with that and let the team jump in. So I can tell you for clean waste streams right now, since the 45Q, is that the right one? Since 45Q was passed, where there's actually government incentives now for every ton you put into the ground, it's now profitable. Now, that's a cleaner waste stream. So I think that legislation is going to need more technology or higher incentives to actually get to natural gas plants and get to coal plants. But on clean streams, it's profitable today with the setup the government has with the incentives that have been put together.
Can you tell us a little more about the 5 industries you said that would benefit from the hub? And maybe go into a little more detail about
You
that?
guys are probably
Yeah, I mentioned that. So okay, let's talk about the different industries. So you have the creation of fertilizer through ammonia, right? That'll be one whole industry in of itself. You have the coking of steel that you use hydrogen for. That's a whole industry. There's industrial gases categorically, right? Then you have mass commercial vehicles, right? So you have semi trucks that want to use hydrogen that today will beat any truck out there on the road, right? In terms of from one point to point, long range being the benefit of hydrogen. So that is commercial vehicles, right? That also includes forklifts. For example, Amazon, they have a choice of doing battery forklifts or hydrogen forklifts. They choose hydrogen because they got to run 24/7. Time to charge these things for 8 hours, right? So that's commercial stuff. Then there's passenger vehicles, right? That's a whole other category. I think we're at number 4 now, right? And that's going to be what we're going to show you out today. Now that's actually the furthest behind because there's no stations, which we want to fix that. We want to get more stations out there so we get to drive these commercial or these passenger vehicles. And the last one is aerospace. NASA's been using hydrogen for aerospace since the Apollo missions. And hydrogen is the lightest, most abundant element in the universe, but the lightness is critical for getting anything into space. Every pound counts. So when you use hydrogen for getting things into space, it is your best option, and that's why NASA, of course, prefers that. So that's the whole other industry. And when we talk about things that want to fly, it can only be hydrogen. So those are your 5 industries.
Okay,
Great job.
Yes.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up question. So why is it that hydrogen is the only option when it comes to
because it's the lightest. So fuel is basically 1/10 the weight of normal fuel today. And most people that are so excited and amped up about, I don't want to say the company name, but the biggest one that everybody knows for battery electric vehicles, they want a car that can fly one day. It'll never fly with a battery vehicle. It weighs too much. And if it does fly, it'll fly for about 3 minutes. But with hydrogen, it'll fly for as long as you want. And it goes fast as you want. And so when it comes to electric flight, hydrogen is your solution. And I'm not the only one saying this. Everybody's saying this in the commercial vehicle space. And everybody wants this energy to come. And right now, if you guys notice, when you buy a plane ticket, it tells you all the carbon emissions that comes with it. Well, with hydrogen, it'll be zero emissions. And that's what we're trying to do. And you could, by the way, add hydrogen to existing fuels. And people do this already. You can add about 12% of hydrogen to natural gas to clean it up, right? So that's getting 12% reduction in emissions right off the bat. And you could do that already with basically other types of planes, et cetera, starting today, then eventually get to zero emissions completely. So that, if it helps answer your question.
If I can answer one thing, actually, there's three of our members of the coalition that actually want to use hydrogen in flight. You could either use it through a fuel cell, or you can actually burn it and displace the jet fuel itself. So Boeing's working on this, and so is Airbus. So is GE with their turbines, and so is Mitsubishi. So that is one place that is moving forward.
Good job, Kurt. Over here.
Angelo touched on it a little bit. President Biden's administration has dedicated $5 billion over 5 years to set up battery electric vehicle charging stations across states. I know the hub or the alliance is kind of new, but have you guys had discussions about the setting up storage and distribution of hydrogen, not only for vehicles, but for aerospace and industry, so that it's accessible throughout the state? What's really for that?
No, we actually did a study a couple years ago, which was a hydrogen station deployment plan. So we've been starting work on that. Also, members of our coalition include the Turnpike Commission, TA Centers of America, and they're actually working with Nikola and putting out those kinds of stations. So that will be a part of this. We did get a corridor designation basically from New York to Chicago as an alternative green corridor, and so those corridors are being worked on at this point.
I just want to touch on that just real quick also. So right now you've got these battery electric vehicles that are on the road already, and they need stations. And what they're looking at now is how do you get energy into remote places? And certain of these companies have come to us saying, hey, can you help us get energy? Because we know that you can take hydrogen and create power from hydrogen. And let's see if we can make some situation work where you can actually have a remote station running on hydrogen that can power a battery electric station. So the beautiful thing, again, about hydrogen is the versatility. It doesn't have to be just hydrogen vehicles. You can have a hydrogen station that can provide power to battery electrics as well to access some of that capital that's been put forth through Biden administration.
Great point. In the back.
Yeah, Angelo referred several times to the health of government. In addition to the DOE loan program, what kind of public incentives will this require and over what period of time? Either, in the next few years or 20 years, to really make this a reality?
It's and I think all of us will probably comment on this a little bit, but there are, I guess, multiple layered approach. The first thing is to get the cost per kilogram of hydrogen. Right now there's a subsidy out there to get the cost per kilogram, I think it's about $3, right, is what we're all looking for. And getting that to be even lower so it's competitive with everything. And so what we want to do is, number one, subsidize basically some of the things that we're doing to create hydrogen to get the cost per kilogram lower. That'll be the first thing. Second thing that companies like ours need help with is getting regulation passed that supports hydrogen, right? Right now, there's a lot of folks in battery support, battery electric. We need regulation to support us for hydrogen as well. That's the second thing. And then third, I think, is support and finance for getting a network of stations out there so you can have an intercontinental or transcontinental hydrogen network. So it's not just in California. We can actually have these beautiful fuel cell trucks going between the whole continent, right? So I think that's what we need to have is basically support for stations, support for the creation of hydrogen, and support to push hydrogen forward, knowing that as an industrial gas, it has a lot of different applications. And anybody else want to comment on that?
I would just suggest, I suspect one other thing we'll need is some support to the power generators. That they're going to need some support to do these conversions to get off of coal or whatever they're burning today, particularly coal plants. And if there's a way to save jobs with this, which I don't think, at least I haven't done that work yet to understand what the job situation might be in one versus the other. But if you're in a place like West Virginia, it's pretty tough when a lot of your economy is built on these jobs if you replace them with something that doesn't have jobs. So my guess is there are ways with hydrogen, if you're really building distribution networks, if you're moving the pieces around, you could probably have some subsidies that would look pretty good to the state that would recreate those jobs in a new form.
And can you give us some kind of figure, the mechanism, whether, you know, a tax credit or money outright or state loans, again, and over what period of time?
I mean, there is a number to essentially recreate the whole U.S. station network to hydrogen. It's a big number. I'm not going to tell about that number. I think we have to start small first and foremost, so that when we transition, it's a slow transition, so we're not putting ourselves in a position that was already discussed where we're over-reliant.
If I could just, so I think that there's two models of hydrogen station deployment in the country. California kind of drove it as a consumer market, so you had it integrated with the stations itself. What we're trying to kind of push here, I think, outside there's 13 ZEV states that have zero emission vehicles. So you've got the other 42 states that we have to have a plan. And it really seems like the tethered fleet concept is where you have a fleet like a bus fleet or a trucking fleet, say like PepsiCo or even the US Mail, where they come back to one location. If you could do those as public-private partnerships, those first stations then can be seeded by really not a whole lot of public subsidy. And we're doing that now with natural gas, and believe it or not, we actually had our first public hydrogen fill this week with Nikola trucks. So I think if we can start having directing incentives that way for the tethered fleet kind of concepts, that's something that will really reduce that price down and get that I think that's the best way for states like Ohio and West Virginia and Pennsylvania to move forward, is that public-private partnership. And even ideas like ODOT's a member coalition of ODOT trucks having fuel cells and that kind of stuff. So we can start having the state fleets and public fleets adopt, then at that point, it's just bring the price down.
It sounds like there's a number out there for what a full transition would cost. I just gotta give it another shot here. I mean, come on.
It's a big number. I think
I
yeah.
don't think anybody here is advocating that the government take that whole number,
Yeah.
and that's why that's not really the push here. The push is for a public-private partnership to actually move things forward.
Let me talk about that because I use that number in my presentations. The reason that number is significant is and why it's so large is it's replicating a centralized distribution model, right? And you need that process. An oil refinery is enormous, right? You need a centralized operation. We have products today that have electrolysis on them that are remote. Electrolysis can be scaled, just like fuel cells can be scaled. You can have a decentralized system that is actually cheaper than today's gas stations alone. And that's the model that Hyperion uses. And so that number that I mentioned would be replacing a centralized network, which is not the solution. The solution is actually decentralized network.
Well, and I think one of the outcomes of this hub study and hub effort is to take that ecosystem on a geographic basis and balance supply and demand. And so if this all works right, then what we'll be able to do is push that price down to the dollar per kilogram that DOE wants, and we'll be able to have it on a balanced location. And I think what we're trying to do is have a minimal amount of public subsidies, because there's already some places now that hydrogen is comparable. I mean, you know, if you take my buses per miles, I'm getting about this. It costs me about the same cost per mile to run a fuel cell bus as it does a diesel vehicle. So there's places already that we're on parity.
And I think the beauty of these studies, you know, there's a dozen studies and a handful of these moving forward, is you're gonna bring a lot of people together. You're gonna have a bake-off, right? You're gonna pull the best ideas in across the country and see what works best and let them compete against each other.
Yep, great point.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Do we have an idea of how much hydrogen is gonna come out of this hub from natural gas as opposed to water and other sources?
So if I could just, the legislation actually said that four of the hubs had to be a prominently blue strategy. So what we're trying to do is write the grant to kind of match what they want. So a large part of it will be blue, so to speak, but we also want to have, you know, electrolyzers, natural gas. So we want to push forward all the technology, but to get what DOE wants, they want one to
Want
be
blue hydrogen.
a blue strategy, at least out of two of the four.
So why do they want most of it to come from natural gas?
Even if you look at our study that we just did with Jobs Ohio, that we think that the need for hydrogen over the next 2050 is going to increase 4 times. And so if you look at everything else, even today, the nuclear can't scale that fast, green electrolyzers can't scale that fast. It's almost like the idea of you still need some, electricity, you still need some base load. And so this is the quickest way that we can get to, using natural gas is the quickest way we can scale, the quickest way that we can get there, and it's actually the cheapest way we can get there, at least right now.
Let me talk about it real quick. So today, 98% of hydrogen that's being used in industrial applications is from natural gas, right? And so you need to wean yourself off of that. Green hydrogen is great, but as mentioned, scaling is a challenge because you want to reduce some of the rare earth metals that go into that. And we're doing that at Hyperion also. And what you want to do is you want to, as mentioned, you want to transition safely, right? You want to start with you want to get to green. We use blue, and there is also already a turquoise. There's all different colors of hydrogen.
We didn't invent it today.
We didn't, not today, no. But you need all of them to get to that ultimate goal. And it's a problem whenever you just focus on one of those. I think it's a great thing that we're using all those different hydrogen mechanisms to get there. So.
What do you think about the risk if you build pipelines to send natural gas, by the time green scales, you still have these pipelines that you spent all this money on? What are they just going to do?
No, pipelines can be used the same. First of all, pipelines are for hydrogen are very cheap, so it's not a huge investment, number one. Number two, the thing that's piping can also be used for piping hydrogen. And so it connects. It is not independent, mutually exclusive.
Texas has like 1,600 miles right now of hydrogen pipeline.
Yeah, and today, actually, hydrogen is used, part of it is actually used to clean up basic crude oil already.
Kind
All
of
right.
builds on this, and maybe a question for Matt to answer, but can you talk a little more of how the natural gas we have in eastern Ohio is a strategic advantage? How you all view that as an advantage for this hub?
Yeah, I wish I had the chart with me, but we still have the cheapest natural gas in the world right now, in eastern Ohio, West Virginia, western Pennsylvania. So to the point about weaning off from gray hydrogen, it makes it immediately economically viable and as abundant as it is, and you're still being able to use it, supports industry. I did fail to mention just last Friday, Long Ridge Energy Terminal, gas-fired power plant, about 485 megawatts in Monroe County, Ohio, had an event because they're starting to blend a little over 5% of hydrogen, not continuously in their natural gas-fired power plant, but starting to do that on a pilot scale. So that goes to the industrial gas, the power generation, and they have plans to continue to increase that. But we have the cheapest gas in the world.
I'd like to thank everybody for being here. I would also remind you that go on the bus ride. It's going to be pretty cool, and look at the new Hyperion vehicle. Might be the coolest car I've ever seen.
No car ride though.
I don't know. That's
We'll
up to,
see.
that's up
We'll
to
see.
Angelo. Maybe you can draw straws for it.
Thanks, everyone.